So, bridging gaps, that's what we're talking about. I want to tell you the story of a man named Sandor Tesler. He was a Jewish person who fled to the United States early in World War II when it was still possible to escape the mayhem there. And he found his way to South Carolina here in the United States, where he found a job in the textile industry, and eventually he worked his way up until he owned his own company. In the 1950s, Tesler was becoming pretty discouraged by the racism that he saw around him and the activities of the Ku Klux Klan. Coming out of the background of persecution, he saw where this kind of hatred could lead, and it touched his heart. He saw truly how things were, and he had this hope and possibility for how things could be. And so he made this decision. He knew that Kings Mountain was one of the most racist, divided communities in all of South Carolina. And he announced that he was going to build his next factory there. He told everyone in Kings Mountain that he was going to simply hire the best people for the job, no matter what race they were. And he ended up, after a search, hiring 8 white men and 8 black men for the job of starting this plant. And on the first day, he gave them an orientation and he gave them a tour of the plant, in which they found 1 bathroom, 1 set of showers, and 1 drinking fountain. And they asked some questions, unsure of what this meant. And his response was very simple. He said, "I'm paying you twice the wages of any textile mill in this area. You can stay and work for me with exactly the way things are, or you can choose to work somewhere else. It's entirely up to you." They all stayed. And several months later, another wave of workers was needed, and the process looked the same, and they all stayed. Now, this process and policy from Mr. Tesler, this courageous stand, was a model for integration that eventually impacted the entire textile industry in our country. He is a great example of bridging a gap. And we can name, so many gaps in our world today. Race is just one. Gender, income, physical limitations and abilities, education, religion, just to name a few of the obvious ones, and some that we'll be exploring over the next few weeks. Lots of ways to bridge the gap. Lots of ways to bring people together. But what I love about Tesler's beautiful story is that he pretty much just jumped into the gap between black and white. Quaker theologian Parker Palmer calls this standing in the tragic gap. The gap between the way things are and the way they could be. The gap between the reality and the possibility. And he uses that word tragic not so much to mean, this is such a sad situation. He uses it the way you would use it in the Greek tragedy sense. This is the kind of story that we repeat again and again in the human condition, making the same mistakes over and over. And so he reminds us that if we're simply depressed about the way things are, this leaves us feeling hopeless, and often we disengage. But if we only look at how things could be, then we're just living in a dream world, in a fantasy soaked in idealism. And so, he says, you stand in the gap. To stand in the gap, you have to hold 2 perspectives in tension, the reality and the possibility. And if you're holding things in tension, then there is no way to fight, no room for violence in word or action, no coercion, no pushiness. To stand in the gap is a true commitment to nonviolence. We sometimes picture nonviolence as just doing nothing. But look at Tesler. He did plenty. He may have been frustrated, he may have been angry, but his behavior was not reactionary. It was intentional. It was about being faithful to what was possible, no matter what anybody else might choose to do. So standing in the gap requires us to have a clear sense of how things really are and a clear vision of how they could be. Standing in the gap takes passion because you have to care deeply to put this much effort in. It takes courage because sometimes you're standing there by yourself. And it takes integrity and honesty and patience. You can't fake this. But this standing in the gap, this is just basically how Jesus lived and what he taught. He pretty much stayed there all day, every day, seeing how things were around him, and always offering and living the possibility of something more, the kingdom of God, how things could be. The writer of John's gospel tells a story of Jesus that doesn't appear in the other gospels. It's a great story of Jesus and the conversation that he had with the woman at the well, the Samaritan woman. You can read it in its entirety, if you wish, in chapter 4 of John's Gospel later today. But this morning, I just want to talk you through the story and comment a little bit. Basically, the story opens with John and his disciples taking a shortcut through Samaria to get back to Galilee. Now, what you need to know is that there is long-standing bad blood between Jews and Samaritans. Not so much a battle, but a way of completely leaving each other alone. They shared nothing. No marriages, no worship, nothing. Now, just as a quick aside, this is why the story of the Good Samaritan that Jesus told was so jarring to the Jews who were listening, because the hero of this story was someone who they counted as suspect, as an enemy. So, they stop in this little town in Samaria at noonday, and the disciples go off to find some food, and Jesus is hanging out by this well when this woman approaches. Funny that she comes in the middle of the day when it is hot, because most people come to the well first thing in the morning. She's coming perhaps to avoid meeting other people. Jesus asks her for a drink of water. Now remember, Samaritans and Jews share nothing. So right away, he has broken the Jew-Samaritan barrier. And she questions him about this. And that gets them started in a beautiful long conversation about water and living water. We find out that this woman has had many husbands, 5, and she's currently living with a man who's not her husband. So Jesus is not only speaking to a Samaritan, he's speaking to a woman with a very bad reputation. Not only is he standing in the tragic, long-standing gap between Jews and Samaritans, he's standing with a woman of ill repute. They have quite a fabulous conversation, both of them being very, very honest. Jesus tells her all about herself and these husbands and the fact that she's not married to the man she lives with now. And because of this, she thinks he must be a prophet. And so she asks him about the fact that the Samaritans worship on the mountain, but the Jews, and they have a shared history of waiting for the Messiah, the Jews worship at the temple. They speak about this, and she knows that the Messiah is coming, and she speaks of that. And here's the real kicker. Jesus tells her that he is, in fact, the anointed one. He is this Messiah. So Jesus is trusting this sinful Samaritan woman with the good news. He's making the announcement to her. Now, about this time, the disciples come back, and they're a little astonished and a little horrified that he is talking with this woman, and she goes off while they converse to tell the people in the town what she has seen and heard. And she said, "This man is amazing. He told me everything about myself. Could it be that he really is the Messiah, the one we are waiting for?" Now, I just want to say that this woman who avoids contact with everybody by going to the well in the middle of the day has gone back to all these people and has herself placed herself in that tragic gap between the people and her so that she can speak about what she has heard. And guess what? They listen. They are curious. They are curious enough to go find Jesus for themselves. And in talking with him, we find that now there's a whole bunch of people standing in the tragic gap, yes? And in that space, they say, "Jesus, would you stay with us for a little while?" And he does. He stays with them for 2 days. And it says that many of them came to believe for themselves. So there's courage and there's honesty and there's this desire for what is possible. And that brings all these people together in what was a great big gap. And now the gap is full of people. That's a lesson for us. One way to bridge a gap is to build a great expanse across any chasm, whether it's architecture or humanity. But if we're following Jesus, it may mean that we're being called to hike out into the middle of a dark, uncharted canyon, or wade into the muddy, murky water, or stand in the dry, bare ditch and stretch our arms out. When we do this, there is no invitation like it.